Hello and welcome to our first session of our seminar, Capital, Form of Flow, with our instructor, Professor Ray Brassier. I'll first introduce you to the topics of our seminar and then give it the word to Professor Ray Brassier. Marx calls production in general rational abstraction. While production is always production by social individuals at a definite stage of social development, the concept of production in general allows us to distinguish those elements common to every stage of production from those specific to some. As a rational abstraction, production in general is not to be reified. Ignoring this caveat, Deleuze and Guattari attribute to Marx the discovery of an activity of production in general and without distinction. This allows them to suggest that their unification of social and desiring production or political and libidinal economy is Marxian in spirit, if not in letter. Yet it is neither. For while social and desiring production are twin attributes of production in general, the latter is substantialized as desire, whose machinations, connective, disjunctive, conjunctive, are transhistorical. The syntheses of desire are the postulates of speculative rather than rational abstraction, removing the vicissitudes of the drives from historically specific relations of production. The speculative conjunction of drive and production, drives are simply the desiring machines themselves, says Deleuze and Guattari, turns capital from a historical nexus, from a historical nexus of social forms and relations into an avatar of cosmic production. For Deleuze and Guattari, the flows of desire are coded at the primary molecular level, but socially overcoded at the secondary molar level. By decoding what has been socially overcoded, capital promises to free desiring production from the fetters of social production, releasing what human sociality has hitherto repressed, desire as production for the sake of production. On this account, capital is no longer primarily a social relation, but the conjunction of two decoded flows, a flow of labor and a flow of money. What Marx called surplus value is redefined as the incommensurability between these two flows, rather than as the difference between the value of labor power and the value it produces. Capital is no longer the conjunction of the commodity form and the class relation. Labor is no longer the commodified source of commodity production. Where for Marx, living labor is required to convert the value of fixed capital into surplus value, Deleuze and Guattari render labor tributary to mechanic surplus value inherent in the means of production as such. Capital's self-moving power is rendered independent of its social relation to labor, which becomes its inert appendage. The limit to capital is no longer the moving contradiction between the expansion of surplus value and the reduction of necessary labor time, but the moment of anti-production, the disjunction of flows immanent to capitalist production itself. Overcoming this disjunction entails the generalized conjunction of flows reuniting humanity and nature beyond subjectivity and objectivity. This last is certainly consonant with Marx's vision of communism as the social organism's reunion with its inorganic body, nature, but at every junction, Deleuze and Guattari replace Marx's analysis of social forms and relations with a description of flows and codes. They replace the critique of political economy with a metaphysical economy that naturalizes social relations and libidinal drives. The result is a metaphysics of production that turns the overcoming of capital from macro-political program targeting the commodity form and class relation into a micro-political ethos maximizing the conjunction of flows, which is to say, the intensification of desire. I'll now give the word to Professor Ray Brassier, who has obtained his PhD in philosophy from the University of Warwick in 2001. From 2002 to 2008, he was a research fellow at Middlesex University's Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy. In 2008, he joined the philosophy department at the American University of Beirut, and he's also the author of Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, and the English translator of works by Alain Badiou and Quentin Meillassoux. And he's now currently working on a book about sellers and Marx, which is a hot topic in the News Center as well. So I now give the word to Professor Ray Brassier. Thanks, Ray.
Okay, thanks, Matthias. Thanks. So before I begin with today's presentation, first of all, I think there's a few kind of, practical considerations that we need to kind of clarify. So first of all, Matthias just mentioned for the assessment for the class will consist of presentations by the students together with an essay, okay, and both can be on a topic of your choice. In other words, rather than kind of stipulating questions or topics, I'll let you kind of formulate questions of your own, depending on whatever strikes you as interesting in the class. But because there's so many of you, I mean, right now I think there's, well, not counting Matthias and myself, there's 43. It's going to be, it seems unfeasible to have these presentations during the class. We only have 8 sessions, 8 2.5-hour sessions. So what I suggest then is that you record your presentations, and they are kind of, shared via email or uploaded, I'm not sure, onto the Google Classroom page. And then we can, watch them together and discuss them, together.
Sorry,
yeah, Matthias.
on that topic, yeah, I think I will be sharing with you a presentation spreadsheet so that you can allocate yourselves in the topics that you are most interested related to our particular sessions. And I think, yeah, we can then go, I'll give you the link for a Drive folder where we can upload the recorded videos. And then we make groups based on this interest and record. Perhaps it would be interesting if we record in the to the weekend that this is planned. So if you're interested in something in the Anti-Oedipus and want to present it, you make your group and you record and upload just before the class. So perhaps you can watch and even I don't know, address some of the issues that the recorded presentations are bringing or something like that. I think that would be interesting if it is okay for everyone. So I'll be sharing the link during the class.
Great, okay, thanks. Yes, the second issue is that usually, I mean, the last time I taught a course for the New Center, it was a much smaller group. So I would, normally invite people to kind of quickly introduce themselves so that, I get a sense, I can, learn your names and, find out a bit more about you, or so that we can all kind of, become at least acquainted. But now, again, it seems it would take too long, I think, if there's 44 people, it would take too long. But I just hope, we can, I hope that's not too uncomfortable for everyone. Okay, so, right, so today I'm gonna share the screen. So I've got a PowerPoint prepared for today. So let me see if I can find, yep, let me see. Okay, so is that clear? Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yep, yes. Okay, right. So I sent a message. Today I'm going to try to kind of start the discussion by considering Jason Reed's introduction to his 2003 book, The Micropolitics of Capital, which I think provides a very useful framing of the main kind of topics and issues that I would like to discuss during this course. And I decided to do this because although originally I was just going to kind of plunge into the opening of Anti-Oedipus, but then I thought that might be a little bit too it's such a difficult book that one immediately gets kind of sucked into the kind of trying to make sense of the terminology. And I thought it'd be useful to kind of, at least to begin by zooming out a bit and by just trying to kind of get a sense of the stakes, the fundamental philosophical and theoretical stakes that are articulated in Deleuze and Guattari's project in relationship to Marx. So that's what we're going to try to do today. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that, which occurred to me while Matthias was reading the summary for the course, is that although it's formulated critically, although the kind of the agenda of the course is formulated critically vis-a-vis Deleuze and Guattari's project, and I will, kind of be critical in certain regards. I don't want to lose sight of what the operation that they are unfolding vis-a-vis Marx is trying to do. In other words, that however critical one may be of the way in which Deleuze and Guattari conjoin, let's say, kind of libidinal and material production, or libidinal and social production. I think that's not to say that those two things don't need to be somehow articulated. So even if their solution is not quite satisfying or raises as many difficulties as it attempts to resolve, that's not to say that they are not responding to a genuine kind of problem or lacunae in let's say kind of orthodox 20th century Marxian accounts. Okay, so I don't want to this is just to say that I don't want to sound as if I'm simply dismissing the project out of hand, and I hope that becomes clear as we proceed through the investigation. Okay, so let's begin. So the title of today's presentation is The Mutation of Critique, and the question it asks is the critique of political economy obsolete? In other words, is Marx's fundamental theoretical investigation of capital and capitalist social forms and of the centrality of class struggle in that analysis, has this somehow been rendered anachronistic by developments in late 20th century capitalism? Okay, and Jason Reed, in his introduction to the micropolitics of capital, I think gives a useful summary of this of the claim that such indeed is the case. Okay, so Reed writes in the opening of his introduction, he writes, "Capitalist production has undergone a profound mutation in the past 30 or so years. Stated briefly, it is no longer possible to separate capital as the producer of goods and commodities from what used to be called the superstructure, the production of ideas, beliefs, perceptions, and tastes. Capitalist production today has either directly appropriated the production of culture, beliefs, and desires, or it has indirectly linked them to the production and circulation of commodities." Okay. So this is the status of what Reed calls the mutation of production. This transformation also entails a fundamental mutation of labor. It is no longer simply physical labor power that is put to work, but knowledges, affects, and desires. In short, capitalist production has taken on a dimension that could be described as micro-political, inserting itself into the texture of day-to-day social existence and ultimately subjectivity itself. Okay. So he continues a little later in his introduction. Reed continues, the old terms of Marxian critique ring hollow because they are not yet attuned to the fact that not only has their object changed, we are no longer living in the 19th century, but the very terms of critique have changed as well. So this is a sense in which the the mutation of production entails a mutation of critique, or a mutation in the mode of critique. It is no longer possible to critique capital according to the grand schemes of universal history, or to oppose it from the last vestiges of values and desires kept isolated from its sweeping mutations. Critique must become attuned to the micro-political dimension of capital. It must become what Michel Foucault called a critical ontology of ourselves. Okay, now there's the two things I want to draw your attention to here in this account, in this opening account. One is the characterization, the claim about the fundamental mutation of labor, that it's no longer simply physical labor power that is put to work, okay, that there's somehow capitalism has transformed its relation to labor. And the first thing to point out here is that, and this is a point that I'll reiterate in this today, in this presentation, is that it seems to me that there's a kind of a misunderstanding of the nature of labor power, of what the commodity labor power is in Marx's critique of political economy. Okay, and it seems to me that it's this in a way, this claim that labor power is is to be understood in some kind of straightforward physical or physically measurable or energetic sense that underwrites in a way the articulation of the critique of political economy onto the base superstructure model, where labor power operates in the base and therefore doesn't help us understand superstructural phenomena, things, the production of knowledges, affects, and desires. Okay, and I think this is one of the things I want to question today. Okay, here's the quotation from Marx, where from Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy, where Marx seems to kind of lay out the base superstructure model, where he seems to kind of situate production or social production in the economic base. So Marx writes, in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of the material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of a society, the real foundation of German word is basis, on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. Okay. Now, if one accepts this, this base superstructure paradigm as, as constitutive of the Marxian conception of critique, then the certain difficulties follow, and as Reid formulates the basic difficulty as follows. So he writes, the mode of production is at one and the same time a limited concept referring to the relations of the economy, and an expansive concept referring to the totality of the social. In each case, the position of consciousness or subjectivity is ambiguous. In the first limited understanding, it is not clear whether subjectivity can itself be included within the relations of production, while in the second, forms of consciousness arise from the base. And it's this, in a way, ambiguity in the conception of the base, whether the base simply whether the base straightforwardly determines consciousness, so that, consciousness, human subjectivity is straightforwardly determined by, economic relations, or whether it's, it's underdetermined. and if it's underdetermined, it's not clear what its relationship to this economic base is to be. It's this kind of ambiguity between the kind of the complete and incomplete determination of the superstructure by the base that leads to what Reid, following Althusser, calls the problematic of the mode of production. And he outlines the four terms of this problematic. One, the relation between consciousness and production. The relations between the different forms of social practice, economic, legal, technological, political, and their effects on each other. 3, the periodization of history into the different modes of production, tribal, ancient, feudal, capitalist, and the transitions between them. And 4thly, the historicity of reproduction and dissolution in every mode of production and their coexistence. So the claim, so Reid, following Althusser, claims that the base superstructure paradigm, where the base is what determines the mode of production, generates these unresolved questions, or these unresolved problems about these in these four domains. Okay. And he usefully suggests that Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari, that their work can be understood as a response to the problematic of the mode of production. That the concepts of apparatus in Foucault and of abstract machine in Deleuze and Guattari are attempts to articulate these the relations between consciousness and production and different forms of social practice on the one hand, and the periodization of history and the transition between modes of production on the other hand. Okay, this means that there's a dichotomy. In a way, it's the base superstructure model that entails a dichotomy between economic production and cultural production. Reid writes, on the one side, stemming from Marx, there are the tools for an examination of the transformations and development of the capitalist mode of production, in which subjectivity remains an afterthought or a consequence, if one assumes that Marx is wedded to the base superstructure model. While on the other side, stemming from Foucault and post-structuralist thinkers, there is an examination of the production of subjectivity as a relation to self, which is examined apart from the transformation of capitalist valorization. And what Reid proposes to do in his work is to bring these two aspects together, to bring the Marxian account of the capitalist mode of production together with, let's say, a kind of a broadly post-structuralist account of the production of subjectivity. In other words, what's at stake here is a supplementation of the Marxian account of production at the base, or economic production, with an account of superstructural production, or the production of subjectivity. But the claim, obviously, is that the base superstructure dichotomy must be undone. It's that it's the very kind of the dualism of base and superstructure is precisely what is dissolved by bringing together social and cultural production. Okay. Okay, so this is why an account of the production of subjectivity is required to supplement a lacuna in the critique of political economy. So Reid writes, the transition from an examination of the mode of production to the production of subjectivity is itself a response to changes in capital itself. As capital moved deeper into the social networks that produce and reproduce life, critical thinking in part followed this migration, turning its attention to the production and reproduction of subjectivity. Okay, so in a way, what allows what allows us to kind of to dissolve the dichotomy of base and superstructure and to give a unified account of production, which includes the production of subjectivity, of consciousness, of affects, of perception, etc., is in a way the Spinozist conception of structural causality as filtered through Althusser. So it's Althusser in For Marx and Reading Capital who proposes that Spinoza offers a paradigm for articulating, that the Spinozist account of substance, attribute, and mode allows us to articulate, in a way, the totality and the singularities encompassed by the totality, without independently of the expressive causality, which Althusser attributes to Hegelian idealism. So structural causality is supposed to supersede, is the materialist alternative to the expressive causality, which is espoused by Hegelian Marxism, according to Althusser. Okay, so Althusser famously writes, the whole existence of the structure consists of its effects. The structure, which is merely a specific combination of its peculiar elements, is nothing outside its effects. And this is the Althusserian account of overdetermination. Okay, so that in a way, this is an example, what Deleuze calls the flattening of substance onto the modes is already what Althusser is proposing with his account of structural causality. So that the claim is that the social totality is not a transcendent instance vis-a-vis its individual modes, but actually is, wholly, manifest in each, in every kind of phase of modal individuation. So the structure is nothing outside of its effects, and this is what undoes the base superstructure, dualism. This is why this entails a monism of production. Okay, so as Reid puts it, there is no pure and simple economy that is transformed and altered by different cultures and belief systems, as there would be on the base superstructure model. There exists only a mode of production, which is always already conditioned and undermined by a particular production of subjectivity. Now here, the subjectivity here is, in a way, a relation to self, as Reid has already, put it. But the claim is that the way in which this, the claim here is that labor power, or the function of labor power in, the articulation of the capitalist totality, is that it's, it's both the generative condition for the reproduction of this totality, and something that is itself inscribed in this, in this totality itself. It's both inside and outside the social structure or the totality. This is why, so subjectivity is both producing and produced. It's producing as living labor, and it's produced as, both as, as labor power, but also as, the modes of perception, affection, and desire that characterize living labor at any kind of phase of capitalist development. Okay. So he reads, continues. So if immanent causality is founded on the rigorously materialist idea that materialism exceeds the production of things and includes the production and productivity of ideas. Now, just there's an issue here. The claim, capitalism for Marx is commodity production, okay? The capitalist mode of production produces commodities, but Marx's whole account of the commodity is that commodity is a junction of the sensible and the supersensible. A commodity is never just a material thing, okay? And it seems to me that if to insist that, you know, Marx's materialism consists in the claim that commodities are merely sensible things, completely kind of, you know, distorts the whole, you know, the Marxian analysis from the beginning, okay? Because it's only if you think that there's things on the one hand, you know, perceptual order, commodities are things on the one hand, and ideas, relations, and desires are not things on the other hand, that you think that there's a bridge, that there's a kind of a bridge needs to be built from the thingly domain of commodities to the, you know, the super thingly domain of ideas, relations, and desires. But this is exactly what Marx denies. The whole point is that commodities are not things in Marx. They're sensible, supersensible, which is to say that they're never merely as junctions of use value and exchange value. They are never kind of, definable in terms of their perceptible properties. Okay, this is why Marx insists that not an atom, not a parcel of matter enters into the exchange value of a commodity, but it's the exchangeability of the commodity that makes it a commodity in the first place. So then this makes the ensuing, the kind of the second half of this sentence, that, you know, the necessary correlates for if one wants to include the production of ideas, relations, and desires into the sphere of material productions, then it seems that one needs to kind of enlarge, you know, the conception of matter. Matter must be said to be in many senses, you know, here, as Reed says, you know, echoing kind of Deleuze, no, actually echoing Aristotle, not Deleuze's reading of Spinoza, because being is said in a single sense, according to the thesis of univocity. But the claim that this, you know, kind of dualism of, in a way, of sensible and supersensible, okay, commits one to an equivocal conception of matter, and to an equivocal materialism, which is precisely entirely absent in Marx, which Marx's materialism does not need, because Marx's materialism is not an ontological thesis at all, and it's not a thesis about the meaning of being, and in fact it's an attempt to kind of circumvent the entire domain of ontology, as we'll see later. Okay, then to continue this sentence. Okay, so if one accepts this equivocal materialism, then the materiality of subjectivity is not said in the same sense as the materiality of production, of machinery and relations of power, and this difference is not historically static. Okay, so in a way, here the monism of production is founded upon an equivocity of matter. Okay, it's because, you know, the only way in which there is production, but there's production of things on the one hand, there's a production of commodities, and there's a production of subjectivity. Okay, so this, you know, allegedly kind of, consistent or coherent materialism is founded upon this fundamental diremption of the, in a way, of the sensible and the supersensible, which Marx's entire analysis of the commodity tries to kind of to circumvent, or to show how the commodity is nothing but the fusion of the sensible, the supersensible, or the so-called the material and the allegedly immaterial. So this modism of production, which is obviously kind of premised on Spinoza, because it means that you have the Spinoza's kind of dualism of thought and extension here is duplicated in the dualism of thingly commodified thing production on the one hand, and the production of subjectivity on the other hand. Okay, so the modes and attributes of substance, which is to say culture on the one hand, the economy on the other, supplant form determinations of social relations, which include subjective and objective determinations. Okay, so in other words, the dualism, the attributive duality of commodity production and subject production is supposed to kind of take the place of Marx's account of the form determinations of capital, which are determinations of social relations, which always include a subjective and objective aspect indissociably. Okay, so Reid writes that capitalist mode of production is itself founded on an abstract subjective potential, the capacity to do any work whatsoever, which it must simultaneously develop through discipline and cooperation and contain through discipline and various techniques of subjectification. Now here, I take it that what he means, or what is meant by abstract subjective potential, is what Marx calls abstract labor. Okay, abstract labor as the characteristic, social form of capitalist commodity production, where abstract labor is the what renders qualitatively heterogeneous modes of concrete labor equivalent. Okay. But again, it seems to me that there's, for Marx, abstract labor is an objective social form, okay, and not really, not a subjective phenomenon in any kind of traditional sense. Abstract labor is the qualitative commensuration of qualitatively heterogeneous concrete labors, and it's a form of objectivation and not of subjectivation, because labor power, it's labor power that is the medium of abstract labor, because it's labor power that is the commodity that is bought and sold in the wage relation. The worker sells her labor power to the capitalist, and she sells this labor power as abstract labor power. Labor power is commodified or objectified living labor, and it's important to separate or to understand the relationship between living labor and labor power in Marx's account, in order to avoid this, I think, this short-circuiting of the subjective and objective aspects of labor. Now, the second aspect, in a way, the arguments for the need to unify, to give a unified account of production, in a way which would include both the economic and the cultural sphere, is the claim that there's been a mutation in production, and that, remember, as Reid put it at the in the very opening, that capitalist production has taken on a dimension that could be called micropolitical, and has, in a way, expanded, to saturate the texture of day-to-day social existence and ultimately subjectivity. So the claim is that the relevant, the decisive shift that renders Marx's, Marx's canonical account, which is supposed to be the base superstructure account, anachronistic, is the claim in a way that now that the superstructure is entirely incorporated into the base. And this is why it's real subsumption, what Marx calls real subsumption, is interpreted as this, in a way, incorporation of the superstructure into the base. Okay, so Reid writes, as for real subsumption, or what Marx sometimes called a specifically capitalist mode of production, subjectivity is not reproduced, but is made directly productive, not in the form of an abstract potentiality for labor or for abstract labor, but in the form of knowledge, desires, and affects. It is this concept of Marx, i.e. real subsumption, that comes closest to at least opening up some of the questions of the present. Capital, and later, a few pages later, Reid writes, capital has extended well beyond the walls of the factory to encompass all of social space. I think that this kind of the spatial metaphor, I think, is significant here. This idea that real subsumption is to be understood in terms of a kind of, on a model of incorporation or of kind of expansion, spatial expansion, which I think is actually misleading and generates difficulties. I think, in fact, the concept of real subsumption that is being proposed here is a Spinozist account, which is radically divergent from the Marxian account. The Spinozist concept of real subsumption is the integration of the superstructure into the base, a production of subjectivity, knowledge, desire, affects. Okay, whereas the Marxian concept of real subsumption is that of the individual inclusion that both solicits and excludes subjectivity, living labor compelled to objectify itself as labor power. And now, this is why I think the contrast that needs to be drawn between two concepts of real subsumption, between the Spinozist, allegedly Marxian account of real subsumption on the one hand, and what I think is the properly Marxian one, corresponds to two concepts of labor. The expression living labor power conflates the subjective and objective aspects of labor, and reifies labor as an ontological potency that obscures the difference between self-objectivating wage labor and objectified slave labor. The contrast is important because the subject that is, one is a subject that is a social object for another because it is a social object for itself. This is wage labor. Okay, the wage laborer is compelled to commodify her labor power, or parts of her cognitive and physical capacities as labor power, which is exchangeable for a wage. But this is a self-objectification that is socially compelled, but not, materially, or not kind of violently imposed in the way in which enslavement is, because the slave is not is simply an object. Is a subject that has been turned into a social object by another subject. Okay, it's simply the wage laborer sells her labor power to the capitalist, whereas the slave is simply an object that is bought and sold. Okay. So in a way, it's because labor power is a property, the propriety relation, in a way, traverses living labor. Living labor is compelled to take on a propriety relation to its own cognitive and physical capacities. That it is, that's a sense in which it is formally free to objectify itself as labor power, and to sell its labor power to a capitalist. Whereas, of course, the slave labor is deprived of this dimension of this, kind of formal freedom, and is simply kind of wholly objectified. And why is this important? Well, this is important because it has consequences for what Deleuze and Guattari mean when they talk about machinic enslavement, which is, according to them, which is their alternative to the account of the Marxian account of real subsumption. And here I want to, I think, one of the most illuminating accounts of what actually, real subsumption means, or what is really subsumed on a Marxian account, is given by Rob Lucas in his essay Feeding the Infant. Rob Lucas is a member of the Endnotes collective. He works for New Left Review, and he's an author and theorist who's, this piece, I'm not sure if this piece has been published, but it's an incredibly illuminating piece, not least for this account of real subsumption. So I'm going to read the key moments of this analysis. So he writes, if the monetary measure seems to subsume the qualities of the commodity, it does so only for an instance. Once bought, this book ceases to perform as a commodity, subsisting simply as your book, unless you decide to sell it on to someone else, because a commodity is exchangeable. But once you've bought the commodity and you own it, it no longer functions as a commodity. It's now just a piece of something that you own. Okay, and your relationship to it is no longer as to a commodity, because you're using it, and you cannot. And the disjunction of use and exchange is central to every commodity except for money, which is used by being exchanged. But every commodity, once it has been exchanged for money, is used, and if it's used, it no longer has the exchangeability, which is essential for, which is the essential characteristic of its being a commodity. Likewise, labor power, once bought with a wage, ceases to present itself as a commodity, dissolving itself into the flows of daily activity. The wage presents itself as the truth of the worker's labor only when they go to market, the labor market. Thus, this ontological mode of inclusion, i.e., the inclusion implied by real subsumption, so far signaled by the term subsumption, appears by the same token extremely weak. The various transactions which make up capital's valorization process constitute a certain unity, which falls back upon itself to reproduce some of its own conditions. Profits are reinvested in subsequent iterations of the process. These exchanges can be understood as the moments of a single process, and thus so can the accompanying dynamic of subsumption, where we are dealing not just with financial or merchant's capital, but with a capital that has taken hold of some production process. Its various exchanges can be seen as enacting the subsumption of another unified process. So it is insofar as my labor participates in this process that it is identified specifically with capital and not just with the wage that I am paid. But although insofar as it inherits a kind of necessity from capital's circuit, subsumption may seem to have deepened here, it has also inherited the contingency of the mere moment of exchange and is still distinctly weak. So if I am in a sense included in a particular capital during the working day, this always remains a particular capital, for the drive to accumulate has the individual firm as its irreducible nexus. It is always a particular firm that offers a wage in order to keep in motion its own production process, that aims to sell the result at a profit, and that returns again to the labor market with the resulting revenues. Strictly speaking, that is to say, understood rigorously, not simply as domination, but as a logical or ontological matter, subsumption under capital occurs only within this basic circuit. Whatever its outcomes, if subsumption under capital, strictly speaking, occurs only at the level of individual capitals, it cannot directly characterize society, especially not at a global level. Okay, so what I want to suggest is going on here, and what I think, although Rob uses the term logical and ontological equivalently in his analysis of the nature of real subsumption in Marx, what I want to suggest is that real subsumption in Marx is logically identifying and not ontologically unifying. Okay. Subsumption is the logical coextensiveness of universal and particular. Okay, so of a universal of value, okay, of value as such, which is the universal, and a particular quantum of value, the value of my labor power or the value of any other commodity in exchange. This coextensiveness occurs through individual inclusions or individual acts of inclusion, subsumptions, which are also exclusions, okay? Not as and they're exclusions of what is, for instance, of the useful qualities of a commodity. Because in the act of exchange, it's, the value of the particular commodity becomes in a way subsumed or incorporated into value as such, but not the particular qualities or properties of the commodity. And this coextensiveness of individual, the inclusion of individual value, but the exclusion of individual qualities is distinct from the coextensiveness of substance and mode. Now, I've said whole in part because I think that in a way, the Althuserian account of structural causality wants to insist that in a way that the structural causality is precisely what precludes the part-whole relation. Okay, that if substance or capitalist, production as such is flattened onto the individual mode, then it's not the mode can't be incorporated within the substance, because the substance has no extent over and above that of its modal individuation. But what I'm suggesting in a way is that there's a problem, and that in a way the attempt to unify the two registers of production, economic production and cultural production, in a way resubstantializes production. Okay, it reifies production and makes it into a substance, okay, a social substance, which is divided or parceled out individually, in individual modes. And the other thing I want to suggest is that there's an articulation that in Marx, the capital is both, in a way, the reason why it's or in a way, Marx's most profound challenge to classical metaphysics is that capital is both one and many. Okay, Marx says capital, there are always many individual capitals, and the logic of capital is the logic of competition amongst individual capitals. But nevertheless, these individual capitals, instantiate a single logic, a single kind of mode of operation. And just as the, in a way that in Marx articulates the universal and the particular, or the abstract and the concrete, in a register which cannot be understood in terms of any kind of canonical metaphysical conception of the relationship between whole and parts, or unity and multiplicity. Okay, I think this is going to be a theme to which we're going to return, because in a way, when Deleuze and Guattari insist that desiring production is necessarily kind of is necessarily the production of multiplicity, that it's of an untotalizable kind of plurality or multiplicity of production. They try to challenge the kind of the metaphysical articulation of the one and the many, but in a way their account generates a monism of production. Okay, that the claim that there is such a thing as production in general, or ontological production, or that being is production, in a way kind of reinstitutes a fusion of the one and the many, or in a way it kind of it's substantializes multiplicity in a manner that Marx, I think, remarkably avoids, in the way in which, through his account of the the logic of capital production and reproduction as involving the participation of the abstract in the concrete, and vice versa. In a way that it's almost as if I think that Marx, in a sense, has solved the problem, the Platonic model of participation, by understanding social processes as irreducibly involving these junctions of matter and form, in a way that cannot be substantialized. Okay, so it's as if, like Marx's account of social process involves, the Aristotelian kind of, dualism of matter and form, without hylomorphism, without, activity being formal and passivity being material. But this is, we'll return to this issue. Okay, so therefore, the real subsumption of the production process is inseparable from commodity exchange, primarily the exchange of labor power for a wage. In other words, you can't understand the process of subsumption. In other words, it's a mistake to think of subsumption in a way spatially or extensively as incorporation or agglomeration or whatever. It happens, it's punctual. Real subsumption is always punctual and irreducibly plural. It involves a kind of, in a way, a manifold of points of subsumption. Now, Matthias, is this, should we pause now for is this a good point to have a break, or?
Yeah, I think so, I guess. We have I think we have one question here in the comments, but perhaps we can, I don't know, we answer and then we make a pause, or perhaps we answer after the pause. I don't know. What do you prefer with?
Okay, so there's okay, I'm just opening the comments now. Okay, there's a comment here. Why is this more difficult than any analytic metaphysics I've ever read? Okay, I'm sorry about this. It's actually, I hope this will become clear, okay, as we go. And I apologize if it's been, you know, it's a bit obscure right now, but I think hopefully it will become clear as we go on. So I'll just try to, and actually in the questions and answers, I'll try to kind of clarify as much as I can, okay? Then there's a question from Sean. The notion that Deleuze unwittingly collapses multiplicity into rigidity and so on, isn't this also bad use critique? Yes, it is. But except that he doesn't say anything about Deleuze and Guattari. He focuses on difference in repetition and logic of sense and the cinema books, and avoids talking about capitalism and schizophrenia. I don't see how D&G are guilty of this and how exactly Marx avoids this. Well, okay, this is something I can't hope to convince, you know, of this, you know, immediately from the get-go. But, you know, I've written, I mean, think of, you know, what Deleuze and Guattari mean by when they talk about, you know, the plane of immanence, or the body without organs, or the earth, or the deterritorialized. I think that if you think that unity is substance, if you think that unity must always be substantial, then it's easy to evade the charge. But actually Heraclitus, okay, is a thinker of unity, because he thinks if you say that everything flows or everything becomes, that's a kind of a thinker of, you know, of that's, you know, the monism of becoming is you know, and Deleuze says so when he kind of espouses the kind of the thesis of uniform being is said in a single sense, but everything of which it is said differs, okay, or is different, okay. But it's the claim that, you know, being is said in a single sense. The claim that there's any kind of, you know, unity in the sense of, or if you want, consistency or integration of being, that is the issue here, okay? So again, so, you know, I'm not going to convince you, you know, initially right here, but this is something we're going to return to again and again. And how exactly Marx avoids this? Marx avoids this by not talking about being at all, and by not having, actually, I think that one of the most fruitful ways to read Marx is to read him as entirely circumventing the discourse of ontology, which is in a way is only rehabilitated in the 20th century in the wake of Heidegger. Because already after Kant, ontology is not, you know, ontology has been superseded by critical philosophy, and then, you know, kind of speculative philosophy also kind of evacuates ontology. And I think that because it's so difficult to separate the question of being from the question of meaning, that in a way, the way to kind of, you know, any attempt to re-engage with ontology embroils you with the question of meaning. And that's why Deleuze writes The Logic of Sense, okay? That's why Deleuze can't kind of, you know, avoid the question of the articulation of being and sense. And he does it in a kind of a completely kind of, non-phenomenological register. But the claim is that you can avoid that issue altogether by simply circumventing ontology. So the claim that ontology, that you need to have an ontology, is the issue here. And Marx doesn't, I think, doesn't need one. His account of, or the point at which it looks like he needs one, when he's talking about, life producing life, as we'll see in a minute, is in a way you could say that for Marx, the conditions for kind of pursuing ontology don't currently obtain. And in a way, in the transition from prehistory to history would be, the conditions which makes ontological interrogation intelligible. But he thinks that there's, he uses the term life when he's talking about kind of, human genus being. And he talks about, life producing life. But he talks about it in terms of what he calls free conscious activity. And I think that free conscious activity in Marx's sense, as this, unprecedented kind of activity, is that for which there is no ontological name. It cannot be named. It cannot be attributively specified in any order of being. Okay, and that's why, I think that's one of the most kind of really interesting kind of claims that the young Marx makes when he's talking about, what Deleuze and Guattari, I think, misinterpret as production in general. There's another question from is there a control function in the when, who, what has the ability to pull the lever of when labor or commodity performs in which form? Can discuss later, but just the role of time and who controls when. Can you simply, would you mind just saying exactly, or just clarifying, because I'm not sure I understand the question. Is there a control function in the when? When you mean the time at which, when real subsumption takes place, or when, when commodity exchange takes place? Would you mind?
Sure. And again, we can bring this up later, but again, if there's this kind of collapsing that happens where like who has access to control when it performs in which sphere?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm just asking if there's a kind of control function to think about there, about, again, perhaps a laborer perhaps does not have the actual control of like how their labor functions, but that there's this kind of I'll pause there because maybe I'm even confusing myself. But again, this control ability of like, if there's subsumption, who has the ability to decide which sphere it performs in?
Thanks. Oh, well, actually, you choose, the wage laborer is formally free to sell her labor power to an employer. Okay. So that's a kind of, a voluntary act. Okay. Of course, it's socially compelled. It turns out that, you have very little control over, who you end up selling your labor power to most of the time. But at least that's, what is supposed to be under your control, according to capitalism, is whether or not you sell your labor power. And you're supposed to be even able to choose who you sell it to, although that is rarely, in fact, the case. But then once it's being sold, once you sell your labor power to the capitalist, then that labor power is subsumed. It becomes, kind of a component of commodity production and value production. And that's not out of your control. That is objectively determined. So you have no control over the subsumption of your labor power in capitalist commodity production or value creation. So yes, so in a way that the when is the the moment of exchange. When you sell your labor power, that's when I guess when the subsumption occurs, and there's a sense in which the reason why the freedom to sell your labor power is a kind of is ultimately a specious form of freedom for Marx, because in fact it's empty. It means everyone is effectively compelled to work in order to live, because if you don't sell your labor power, you'll starve. Okay, who you sell it to, under what conditions you work, what commodities you produce, none of those things are under your control. They're all kind of determined by relations of production. Okay. There's another question from Andrew. Okay, well, yes, you can, if you can ask, in the after, maybe hopefully we have a proper kind of, what time is it now? It's, we should have enough time for questions at the end.
I would just, right, I just suggest, I think Arman and Despina had their hands raised to make a question, then perhaps we could answer their questions and make the pause, then we go back to the presentation.
Okay.
To the presentation, and then
okay,
we have
sure.
a final moment for, yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay.
So, if Arman or Despina.
Yes, thank you very much. I try to be quick. One thing that I want to ask a question about is this idea of anti-production in Deleuze and Guattari, because it's not all about production, it's about also the repellent force of anti-production that makes actually the body without organ, the body of earth or body of capital or body of tyrant. So production won't be the only force. The ontological force would be the opposition between production and anti-production, a Freudian opposition, I think. Then if we understand it in that way, the role of anti-production actually would be what, as much as I understand it, would be what Marx talks about in surplus value, because it's not the product of labor. It's something that it's a force of anti-production as regarding production as a process that is already there before the subject becomes subject. The first moment of repression becomes the moment of anti-production, if I remember correctly. That is the body of. Maybe my question is would be better answered later. Just the idea of anti-production. I would love to hear about it more. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So the moment of anti-production, I mean, it's crucial in their account and the opening of Anti-Oedipus. It's they talk about flows, and then they talk about the interruption, the flow and then the cut. Okay. And anti-production is the cut, or the interruption of the flow. Now, how this is, okay, so in terms of the functioning of desiring production, it can be abstractly understood, but in terms of, I mean, I think it's linked, the link that you suggested to surplus value is, I'm not sure, I mean, what is it that's produced in Marx? It's value that's produced, okay? That is what, that is the object of production. commodity production is value production. Every commodity is a, is a receptacle of a magnitude or a quantum of value. Okay, and the sum total of commodities is the totality of value, which must expand, must increase. Okay, so self-expanding value is value compelled to increase and amplify itself, and value is is abstract and homogeneous. It can only be quantified. In that regard, then I don't think so. If that's what you mean by anti-production, if by anti-production you mean if surplus value is anti-production because it is devoid of determinate qualities or characteristics, then okay, that may well be the case, but then the whole point about capitalist production is that the qualitative heterogeneity or the multiplicity of commodities, all the different kinds of commodities that capitalism produces are ultimately, their heterogeneity, their qualitative diversity is ultimately just a kind of a veneer for their homogeneity. They're all the same kind of, they're all embodying the same kind of stuff, which is just value as such. And that's why, in a way, it's that's why Marx says that the kind of, it's a mistake to be kind of, to be taken in by the apparent heterogeneity of capitalist productivity, because it's really always producing the same thing over and over again. And the point is that, and once the usefulness of a commodity is merely, so to speak, an appendage to its, its exchangeability or its abstract kind of value, then, even the kinds of, the ways of consuming commodities, the ways in which we can use them and find them useful, is ultimately kind of subservient to value accumulation. And I think, this is why, like, stuff on, recent work on, this is why the extent to which capitalism is a motor of technological innovation, or of innovation as such, is actually very questionable. The claim that, recent work by, Jason Smith and Aaron Banana shows that, there hasn't been, lots of the time capitalism is repackaging kind of, already kind of familiar kind of modes of technological innovations, okay? Because it's ultimately, it's not about creating new use values. It's simply about, always finding new ways to kind of, finding new ways to tack existing use values onto unfamiliar, unfamiliar kind of embodiments of abstract value or exchangeability. Okay, so, and there was someone else who had put their hand up.
Yeah, it was me.
Yes, sorry, yes.
So, actually, I have to admit, I'm not familiar, I'm not directly familiar with Marx's work. So this is why I wanted to sign up to this seminar, so as to have the opportunity to read directly his texts. But I am familiar with his work through other philosophers that reference him, like Deleuze, Guattari, Lyotard, Klossowski. Nietzsche is not referenced in Marx, but I am more familiar with, let's say, the philosophers of impulses.
Mm-hmm.
So my concern, from what I'm getting so far, is the paradigm that we are operating inside, because I see at some point ideas such as those of object, subject, what you said about Marx talking about the operation of capital as a free conscious activity. And all of these ideas presuppose a dogmatic image of thought, if we go to Deleuze, for example, based on dialectics. So I'm wondering, and maybe this is something that will be, I guess it will be examined throughout the whole seminar and through our assignments. I'm wondering how this dialectical point of view comes to work with non-dialectical approaches. And on that note, I should say that the way that the body without organs is used in Anti-Oedipus is not as successful as it is, for example, in 1,000 Plateaus, in my opinion. Because in Anti-Oedipus, we see the body without organs presented somehow as a kind of an Orphic egg that creates exteriorities and interiorities. So my question is, if we could go to, for example, to the body without organs in 1,000 Plateaus instead of using the Anti-Oedipus version. So this is my main question. And then the other thing is just a concern that I'm having, and I suppose that it's in, you know, a work in progress, about the paradigm that we are operating, because I don't think that we can answer the object-subject binary through the body without organs, because the body without organs doesn't even have binaries. Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, we're just about to discuss, you know, in the presentation, there is a, you know, couple of passages from Deleuze's, you know, rejection of, you know, the image of thought in which, you know, dialectical image of thoughts, you know, the Kantian, the critical image of thoughts, the kind of the speculative dialectical image of thought, and his claim that critique, you know, Nietzsche's great contribution is to kind of propose a new image of thought, where critique becomes evaluation. Now, there's lots to say about, obviously Deleuze and Guattari rejects, you know, subject-object distinction, which they see is, you know, it comes from Kant, not Descartes, but Kant, and obviously it's consummated. It reaches its kind of its consummation in Hegel, who Deleuze detests, and his entire project is an attempt to kind of, you know, do something other than Hegel. But there's a problem here. What is a dogmatic image of thought? What is dogmatism? Remember that Kant's critique of metaphysics is a critique of what he calls dogmatic rationalism and empiricist skepticism. So on those on the one hand who claim to be able to know what there is, or who claim to be able to kind of to know the fundamental structure of reality or of being, through the use of reason alone, through kind of sheer intellectual deduction. And on the other hand, those who claim that kind of knowledge is impossible because all we have are, you know, all we have is this flux of sensory experiences, which doesn't allow us to make any kind of determinate judgments about what, you know, what there is or what there isn't. Okay. So the claim is that so the whole problem of representation in Kant and the critical philosophy is about how the subject is able to kind of, to represent an object to itself, is a question of, how do you know? Okay, so it's a challenge to dogmatism, because anytime someone claims to know something, I know that everything flows. I know that being is multiple. The answer is, well, how do you know this? Why is everything multiple? What do you mean when you say everything? Okay, what is it to be a thing? And what is it for something to be, how do we adjudicate the difference between oneness and manyness? Okay, these are the questions which critical philosophy asks. Now, the problem you have is if you reject the problem of representation and you reject epistemology as the starting point for philosophy, you need to kind of, you've also got to kind of, circumvent Kant's critique of dogmatic rationalism and implicit skepticism. So in other words, you have to claim that your starting point is neither intellectual intuition, the intellectual intuition of being. I know that being is one. I just know it, okay? I intuit it. I know that being is many. I intuit it. Or the claim that knowledge, well, I don't know, I can't know being, but I know about my own sensations and experiences, okay? But then...
There is also a third option.
What is the third option?
Not starting from the thinking I, from the cogito. So in Difference and Repetition, the third chapter talks about this dogmatic image of thought. And it says that there is always this presupposition of a thinking subject, even if this thinking subject understands reality, grasps reality via logic, or via the senses. In both cases, there is this presupposition of a unified self. But Deleuze and Guattari and Nietzsche, first of all, or Sade, I don't know, but Nietzsche for sure, suggested this dissolution of the self. So this is the third option.
Sure. Well, there's two things. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned difference in repetition, because as Deleuze himself points out, difference in repetition, the self is not the subject. So there's a difference between saying, if you reject the claim that Kant is a thinker, that Kant and Hegel are thinkers of the self, is false, because the Kantian subject is not. Kant evacuates the subject of substance, and the I think that must accompany all my representations in Kant is the I or he or she or it, the thing that thinks. And the thing that thinks is precisely not reducible to the ego. This is why Kant is not Descartes, okay? And the same holds for Hegel. For Hegel, the kind of the pure I in Hegel is this pure negativity, self-relating negativity, which is precisely the kind of the dissolution and destruction of every kind of substantial attribution or positive characterization. So subjectivity in Kant and Hegel is a point of negation or of subtraction, if you want. And it's got nothing to do with the philosophy of the self or the unity of, the unity of sensory or worldly experience in the ordinary sense. And the claim is, if you want an alternative, now in Deleuze, it's the kind of, you're forced to think through the kind of, the disjunctive use of the faculties. So you're always kind of, you never choose to think, you're always forced to think by something, in sensation that cannot be recognized, difference in itself, okay? But this whole account, so, there's, in a way, there is still a resort to something like, there is still a subject of thought in Deleuze, but it's an impersonal and anonymous, it's the nomadic subject. It's this impersonal and anonymous kind of subject of thinking, which is ultimately kind of, like thought thinking itself in,
a distributed subject.
Yes. But then the question is, if you claim that what allows you to think beyond dogmatic rationalism and skeptical empiricism is this kind of this circuit whereby thought is able to kind of, you know, to access the impersonal, the pre-individual, you know, the etc., all the stuff that Deleuze talks about in difference and repetition. This is still, you know, an ontological construction. It still involves, you know, an account of the nature of thought and an account of the individuation of, you know, the thinker, which Deleuze kind of develops, which, you know, is not, you know, about which all sorts of questions can be raised. In other words, it's not as if it's less questionable or less, you know, it raises fewer problems and objections than, you know, either the Cartesian, Kantian, Hegelian paradigms that kind of Deleuze dismisses as dogmatic. And in a sense, if dogmatism is a claim, you know, what is dogmatism for Kant? It's an assertion that refuses to justify itself, that refuses to kind of, you know, to validate, you know, it's an assertion or an affirmation that refuses to be interpolated by the game of giving and asking for reasons, just because, okay? And in what sense is that not dogmatic? Okay, if you affirm that it's a difference in itself that causes us to think, okay, and I say, well, how, why, explain this to me, okay, which Deleuze does, but whatever else Deleuze's account is, it's not self-evident or kind of beyond philosophical or kind of removed from the domain of philosophical justification. Unless, of course, you claim that philosophy is not about justifying or explaining, but about affirming and creating, which is exactly what Deleuze does. And then you need to explain why affirming and creating, and why simply affirming for the sake of affirming and creating for the sake of creating is somehow not dogmatic. Because there are
it's not according to Deleuze, at least, because I'm with the Deleuze. Mm-hmm. I'm not with Kant at all. Mm-hmm. I would say that for Deleuze, at least in difference and repetition, the dogmatism of thought is defined when someone takes dialectics as the sole methodology for making meaning manifest. So he doesn't dismiss dialectics as a whole, but he says that it's a mistake to take a methodology that was about the logical veridiction of sentences to displace it as the methodology per se for the making of sense. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Yeah, okay, I was just raising my concern about the paradigms that we are operating with and how they can work with each other. So, yeah.
Well, I take your point.
But yeah.
No, I take your point. And look, I mean, this is, you know, I'm not hoping to convince you, but I think I will say more about, you know, I mean, I'll talk about Deleuze's kind of, you know, rejection of dialectics in a minute, and his alternative paradigm of critique, and I'm sure we'll return to this issue, you know, later. So I think there'll be, you know, more conversations about this. Is there any other questions I should answer before proceeding?
No, I think it's better if we can make the pause right now, perhaps 5
sure.
minutes, and then we go back to the presentation.
What I'll do, but I'll note the questions and I'll try to respond in the questions after, you know, first thing after the presentation.
All right, perfect. So yeah, I will be sharing the link for the presentations now during the pause, so everybody, as you come back here, you can start looking at it. So then I'm gonna pause it here, and we see each all in 5. All right. Perfect.
Okay. So let's maybe just try to. Okay. So we paused at the moment where just after this discussion of real subsumption and the difference between this, the kind of, let's say, this Spinozist Marxian take on real subsumption and the kind of what I think is the properly kind of Marxist account, which is that real subsumption is logically identifying and not ontologically unifying. In other words, subsumption is about the reduction of activity to its value substance. Okay, but it's not about it's not simply incorporation or amalgamation in a kind of physiological or spatial sense. Now, Reid points out, again, very usefully, points out a key kind of disjunction in the attempt to kind of to update Marx in terms of this mutation, this so-called mutation of production entailed by real subsumption. And this is that the de-anthropologization of labor, okay? And it's this de-anthropologization of labor which I think, yields the ontologization of production, which is, fundamental to the the Spinozist recoding of Marx, and it's fundamental to Deleuze and Guattari's account. So Reid writes, the rejection of a traditional Marxist inquiry into the exploitation of labor, exploitation of wage labor in the wage relation, takes the form of the redefinition of an expansive sense of production. Note the term expansive. The idea is that Marx had a restricted sense of production, commodity production, and which must be expanded. Okay, the production of desire or the productivity of power relations. There is a critique of the idea of production or labor as an anthropological constant that opens up the possibility of an exploration of the productivity and materiality of multiple dimensions of human existence. The rejection of an anthropological and instrumental schema of labor, a subject working on an object through the use of an instrument, would historically coincide with the rise of a services and knowledge-based economy in which labor has expanded to include the production of subjectivity, taste, desires, concepts by subjectivity. The production of subjectivity by subjectivity. And here Reid is reasserting his claim that it's the subjectivity as a relation to self that is fundamental here. One thing to observe, though, is that the so-called the anthropological instrumental schema of labor as a subject working on an object via an instrument is also, I think, fails to take into account what Marx means by abstract labor. And the point is that in capitalist commodity production involves, in a way, the equivalence, the exchangeability of labor, the commodification of labor, and the commodification of labor as wage labor entails the abstraction of labor as such. Okay, what does this mean? This means that, in a way, what I think is the distinction between material and immaterial labor is based on a failure to understand the distinction between concrete and abstract labor. For Marx, there's no such thing as material labor. The point of it, that's not what Marx means by, the mistake is to think that labor involves kind of doing something, you know, with your hand, you know, or something that you can kind of, you know, that can be, you know, physically measured. Whereas Marx's whole point is that labor becomes a commodity that produces other commodities in the capitalist economy at the point where productive activity is no longer measured by any purely physiological or you know, empirically accessible characteristics. That's why it's you know, it's under capitalism that labor becomes a fundamental social category. You know, everyone is compelled to work to live, but that's because labor as such is an abstraction which can be realized in any you know, in an endless, almost endless kind of variety of ways. And this is why the claim, for instance, that you know, service and knowledge-based economy somehow requires amending Marx's account of labor is, I think, a complete misunderstanding. Working in a call center is perfectly Marx's account of you know, commodified labor power. The call center worker is, you know, responding, answering people's queries, you know, being helpful, etc. That is labor in exactly the same sense for Marx as the labor involved in constructing an automobile, driving an airplane, or soldering, you know, soldering iron or whatever. That the whole point of abstract labor is that all those things become equivalent, okay? And the distinction, and because a commodity is simultaneously sensible and super sensible, the identification of labor with this so-called instrumental schema, which involves, again, you know, producing kind of, you know, tangible or perceptible physical objects is, I think, you know, a serious misunderstanding. So in other words, you only need to kind of to supplement, you know, to move to production, you know, if you don't understand that commodity production is already production in general, value production, then you're going to kind of assume that labor, you're going to identify labor with production, whereas labor is in fact an instrument of production under capitalism. It's also to assume that it is living labor that is productive, whereas for Marx it is labor power, which is commodified or dead labor, that is productive for capital. Commodity production is value production as the abstract equivalence of concrete labors. And it's only abstract labor that is generically productive for Marx. This is why we have two kind of different conceptions of generic productivity. There's a generic productivity of value, which is quantitatively infinite, but qualitatively homogeneous. Every commodity is, you know, the embodiment of a magnitude of value. So all commodities are valuable, but they're all the same. Okay, the value that they embody is the same. Okay? It's only kind of quantitatively differentiated in terms of the socially necessary labor time that's gone into its production. And this conception of generic productivity is contrasted to another conception of generic productivity, which we can see in the young Marx, which is the generic productivity of what Marx calls free conscious activity, which is, which is that of an infinite qualitative heterogeneity. Okay, so now if we look at the extract from Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts, of 1844, where he talks about life activity. So Marx writes, for labor, life activity, productive life itself, appears to man in the first place merely as a means of satisfying a need, the need to maintain physical existence. Yet the productive life is the life of the genus. It is life engendering life. The whole character of a genus, its genus character, is contained in the character of its life activity, and free conscious activity is man's genus character. Life itself appears only as a means to life. And it's this, it's life is only, life becomes an end in itself. Generic productivity, or life-producing life for Marx, is free conscious activity, which is no longer subordinated to the satisfaction of, let's say, biological needs, but becomes self-determining, and autonomous, in that it creates its own needs, which is to say, it becomes akin to desire. It desires, it becomes purely productive, and in a way, it determines both its ends and its means, from itself. Okay. This is the sense in which productive life itself is, life itself appears only as a means. It's an end. Life would be an end in itself. Okay, and life becomes an end in itself when it's no longer subordinated, for instance, to biological reproduction or survival, so this is the characteristic of free conscious activity, or the generic activity of humanity, which Marx distinguishes from, let's say, merely biological activity. So Marx writes, the animal is immediately one with its life activity. It does not distinguish itself from it. It is its life activity. Whereas man, or the human, makes his life activity itself the object of his will and of his consciousness. He has conscious life activity. It is not a determination with which he directly merges. He says he has conscious life activity, but he is not, it's the difference between being and having, okay? It is not a determination with which he directly merges. Conscious life activity distinguishes man immediately from animal life activity. It is just because of this that he is a genus being, Gattungswesen, or it is only because he is a genus being that he is a conscious being, that his own life is an object for him. Only because of that is his activity free activity. Estranged labor reverses this relationship so that it is just because man is a conscious being that he makes his life activity, his essential being, a mere means to his existence. Okay, there's two things I'd like to draw your attention to here. One is that the importance, the standard English translation of Gattungswesen is as species being. But I think it's better to translate it as genus being, because a genus is unlike anything else, okay? A species is a species of a genus. It's a subdivision of a genus. And in Aristotelian metaphysics, the generic divisions in being are fundamental and irreducible. And to say that they are they are, sufficient unto themselves. They can't be derived from anything more fundamental, nor can they be subsumed under any more kind of higher determination. So to claim, so the term Gattungswesen or genus being is the claim that free conscious activity is unlike any other activity carried out by other beings. In other words, it's unlike biological activity, whose means and ends are, biologically kind of determined and constrained, and it's an activity which is, properly self-determining. Okay, which this is life creating life in Marx's sense. But this activity involves an objectification for Marx. In other words, when he writes, it's only because he is a genus being that he is a conscious being, i.e., that his own life is an object for him. In other words, the objectivation of activity is precisely what allows it to surpass the kinds of the purely objective determinations that it would have if it was merely a specific, a biologically specific activity. It's also the sense that for Marx, and we'll see this when we look at another kind of his critique of Hegel in the manuscripts, is that the subjectivity of social production in Marx's sense is, in a way, kind of objective. It's an objective form of subjectivation. So in other words, that there is there's a coincidence of subject and object in this generic human activity, free conscious activity, which leads it to objectify itself in a product, but this product is something that immediately transforms life's self-relation or life's relationship to itself. And this is why free conscious activity is not merely vital activity, or this kind of its spontaneity is not it's not the immediacy of, let's say, animal vitality or biological vitality. Okay, so what is the point of this? The contrast that Marx is drawing here is between life producing life versus life as a means for life. And in a way, what Marx's whole account of alienated labor is that life becomes a means for life. Okay, in other words, when when you're compelled to work in order to live, as you are in a capitalist society, it means that your life becomes a means to an end. The emancipation of labor, or unalienated, the de-alienation of labor, would allow kind of productive activity to become an end in itself. Universal life, generic, generic human activity produces itself through its individual expression. Okay, this would be unestranged labor. Whereas individual life, under capital or alienated labor, uses universal life as a means to produce only itself. In other words, the cognitive and physiological capacities of the human organism under capitalism our means are subordinated to individual reproduction, but now the individual is compelled to reproduce itself while allowing capital to expand and augment itself. So in other words, so that the in alienated labor, you know, human productive capacities, both cognitive and physical, are a means whereby capital or value keeps expanding and increasing itself. You know, humanity becomes an appendage to, you know, to the expansion of capital. In the first case, you know, in the first case, life producing life, universal life consciously produces itself, whereas in the second case, when life is a means for life, individual life instinctively reproduces itself. And in a way, I think what Marx is saying is that the formal freedom of wage labor under capital reduces the you know, the creative spontaneity that should be the you know, the generic characteristic of humanity to the function of instinctual reproduction. Okay, so we are compelled to reproduce ourselves by working, you know, by creating value for capital, and capital, in a way, you know, kind of appropriates, you know, the creative, cognitive, and physiological capacities of human beings to kind of to keep on infinitely expanding. So here the contrast we have is between generic productivity of abstract labor is the estranged form of free conscious activity, or the universal life producing itself through individual activity. Free conscious activity would be universal life producing itself through individual activity, and the generic productivity of abstract labor, which just produces more and more value, more and more commodified value, is the, you know, what Marx calls the estranged form of free conscious activity. But of course, now traditionally, at this point, the classical objection to make is that this is a classical humanist essentialism, and that Marx has to kind of suppose an originary unalienated state, you know, an originary unestranged state, in order to kind of, you know, as the condition of estrangement. I actually think that that is a misreading, and I actually think that for Marx, estrangement is the condition of de-estrangement. I actually think it's not true that there's an originary unalienated labor, a kind of, you know, spontaneous production, which then is alienated, you know, under capital as wage labor, and will then subsequently be kind of de-alienated. I think precisely that, you know, the proper way to read Marx is insisting that the estrangement, which is exemplified in the money form, and he talks about it in these manuscripts, when Marx talks about the divine power of money to commensurate incommensurables, to kind of, as to harmonize impossibilities, to fraternize impossibilities, is the estranged manifestation of you know, free conscious activity, of generic human activity. So in a way, so it's the objectified and alienated form of human productive activity that becomes the condition for de-estrangement and for the release of free conscious activity, or life-producing life. Which is why for Marx, the full expression of the generic in the individual can only be historically realized. And this is exactly what he means by communism. Communism is the historical transformation of human being, the transformation of the abolishing of the capitalist mode of production. And communism, therefore, is the abolition of human types. okay, of the class relation, but also of the distinction of the typology of the human. And this is to be opposed to, I think, the Nietzschean paradigm, which is one of metaphysical transvaluation, where the overman becomes, the superior successor to the human type. Okay, so on the one hand, we've got historical transformation, communism as historical transformation. On the other hand, we have the prospect of a metaphysical transvaluation, and this is where we encounter Deleuze. Obviously, Deleuze claims that critique, the proper paradigm of critique, is as evaluation. Deleuze, right, this is from Nietzschean philosophy, okay? The problem of critique is that of the value of values, of the evaluation from which their value arises. That's the problem of their creation. Evaluation is defined as the differential element of corresponding values, an element which is both critical and creative. Value here means sense, okay? The creation of value is the creation of sense. So the evaluation of values is the evaluation of senses which are produced through, differential concatenations of forces, of active and reactive forces. Evaluations, in essence, are not values, but ways of being, modes of existence of those who judge and evaluate, serving as principles for the values on the basis of which they judge. This is why we always have the beliefs, feelings, and thoughts that we deserve, given our way of being or our style of being. Okay, notes, this is Deleuze's Nietzscheanism. Okay, we have the beliefs, feelings, and thoughts we deserve, given our way of life, or our mode of life. Okay, in other words, what you believe, how you feel, what you think is a function of your way of being. Okay. Here's Deleuze, later in the same book.
Can I ask for a clarification on?
Sure, yes.
Quickly, just if you go back to the last slide.
Yes.
So when you're saying Deleuze understands value as sense here, are you meaning sense in a way that's distinct from, sense incorporates meaning, but also affect or?
Yes, sense is, meaning is propositional, sense is non-propositional, okay? Mm-hmm. So meaning is, a proposition is meaningful or meaningless, okay? Any well-formed proposition must be meaningful. So judgment for Deleuze is meaningful, but Deleuze is against meaning and judgment, but he's for sense. And what is sense? Sense is, cannot be propositionally encapsulated, okay? Mm. So sense is, constituted through, the differential kind of interplay of forces. Every concatenation of forces, yields a sense which expresses a value, which is there to be evaluated. Okay, so organisms, so beings relate to one another. Beings evaluate one another's and evaluate one another's behaviors, perceptions, affections, etc., etc.
So value is an expression of, or is indistinct from practice, and an expression of a form of life, right?
Yes, or well, a form of practice is a. Yes, in the sense of yes. Okay, this is why there's no. It's a mistake. Different forms of life, different ways of being have different values, and therefore it's a mistake. So the rejection of universalism, of Kantianism, Hegelianism, etc., is to say that there is no value of values, which is why the rejection of goodness, truth, and beauty is that goodness, truth, and beauty have been traditionally elevated as the supreme values. Okay. All values must be kind of subordinated to goodness, truth, and beauty. But what Deleuze, following Nietzsche, is saying is that no, there's no such thing as these all kind of subsuming, kind of totalizing values are based on, are themselves the products of a reactive form of life. The moral evaluation of the world, which must be kind of superseded. so that we can recognize the multiplicity, the plurality, and the antagonistic plurality of values and of forms of life. Okay,
yeah, I think that's clear. Yeah, just to reiterate, then you're distinguishing here between Marx's conception of value, which you're basically saying is a kind of Hegelian purposive one.
Well, no, because
no,
you have to be careful here, because value, so far, what we've been talking about, value for Marx here, is value as this abstract commensurability or exchangeability of everything. So Marx is also a critique of, let's say, kind of identitarian, this abstract homogenizing universality. But his claim is that this is a perversion, this is a false or a spurious universality. So value, and Marx is also saying, what Marx I think is also saying, is that the differences in sense or value that we claim to be able to recognize using our current intellectual and practical resources are themselves kind of masks of value, of this, our surreptitious kind of avatars of this actually utterly homogeneous kind of value as such, which is why the aesthetic evaluation, the Nietzschean aesthetic evaluation of the world, the world can only be kind of justified as an aesthetic phenomenon. It can't be judged as right or wrong or as true or false. What Marx is saying, that this aesthetic evaluation, okay, presupposes, in a way, an abstraction from the, commodified value, from the homogeneity of capitalist kind of value production. And the question is how? How is this possible? How are you able to do this? How are you able to intuit these values, okay, these kind of differential quanta of forces independently of the, in a way, the kind of in a way that the capitalist kind of circumscription, of meaning, because the point is that capitalism also produces sense. It's not just aesthetic experience that produces non-propositional sense. It's that capitalism produces meaningless kind of sense, ways of feeling, responding, evaluating, but these, it's what Marx is saying, it's a mistake to think that these are kind of pure eruptions of, nature in itself or being in itself. They're actually, avatars or complex social relations, not dynamisms of force, but antagonistic social relations. So what I'm saying here, so in a way, Marx is playing, Deleuze is playing Nietzsche off against Marx, is saying Nietzsche is more radical than Marx. Marx is just an old Hegelian who thinks that kind of, who still believes in goodness, truth, and beauty. What I'm saying is that there's the Marxian critique of the value form and of the logic of commodification and of reification and of the way in which subjectivation always involves, corollary of objectivation. Everything is simultaneously subjective and objective, is actually, more incisive, undercuts the attempts to segregate a sphere of, sub-propositional value, or a field of forces, forces in themselves, okay, forces operating independently of social relations. This is the question. What, is there a world of forces independently of social relations? Okay, and Nietzsche says yes, and Marx says no, there isn't. Okay, so
can we stick on? Oh yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. Go on.
Oh yeah, wanted to stick on this point maybe to avoid a bit of confusion, but yeah, to sort of distinguish between Marx's account of value in the critique of political economy, and I guess what I was thinking of as the connection between value and meaning, maybe, or just sort of trying to relate your previous comments on alienation as a kind of disruption of practical reason and desire, or a kind of moment in the realization of the mediation of these things, that Marx's account in some ways is about how sort of homogeneous abstract value under capitalism prevents, sort of short circuits, the kind of meaningful, purposively directed activity of conscious free beings, right? And that's the sort of distinguishing between value as affirmation of simply what a practice is, and being able to distinguish between what is and what ought, and make arguments for the ought or the good, right? Which is the Hegelian background on Marx. And it seems to me that what you're saying, or how to understand Marx, is critiquing the form of value internal to political economy or to the capitalist mode of production that keeps us from being able to talk about the good in some ways, right? That like,
yes, but also what he's also saying, this is why I think, I mean, it's not very clear, I haven't developed it very clear, but what I think that Marx is saying is that what's really interesting is that Marx's the critique of political economy is the critique of value, saying that all the values that humans, aesthetic value, religious value, moral value, etc., are all kind of mired in, capitalist value creation. They're all ultimately, it's not possible to disintricate the values that we, in terms of, or the meanings in terms of which we orient ourselves, living in a kind of, existing in a kind of capitalist society, from the ultimately the kind of, the meaningless, the meaningless condition, or the unevaluable condition of all evaluation, which is value as such, which is what it's measured by money. Okay, because the money form is the most the crucial kind of embodiment of the value form. It's the way in which kind of value relates to itself. And when Marx says that talks about the what he calls the fetishism of commodities, is material relations between producers being turned into social relations between products, okay, or commodities. Social relations between products are that it's commodities talk to one another, commodities communicate to one another, and they communicate to one another through the medium of money, okay? And money is, in a way, shapes, what he's saying is that money kind of, shapes and determines, not only the relationships that commodities have to one another, but the relationship that, commodity producers have to one another. And that this has, more fundamental kind of consequences for understanding, the possibilities of human interaction than is, usually kind of appreciated. And so the point I'm making is that he's not simply saying, oh, the world used to be meaningful, we used to have goodness, truth, and beauty, and then capitalism came along and kind of ruined it all. He's saying that, in a way, capitalism has dissolved goodness, truth, and beauty as we knew them in every other kind of, social kind of social register. And this is actually one of the Deleuze and Guattari kind of, when you talk about capitalism as the kind of the monstrous kind of pathology that must be warded off by all other social formations, you know, they're talking about this kind of you know, the anti-social aspect of capital, the way in which it kind of, you know, it disintegrates and, you know, unearths all kind of pre-existing kind of social relations, but it's still ultimately capital is still the expression of a social relation, but now a social relation which is one of fundamental, which is fundamentally antagonistic, and which generates a fundamental contradiction. Okay, you know, so that capital society is fundamentally contradictory, and it's this contradictoriness that both dissolves all, you know, preceding horizons of goodness, truth, and beauty, but the overcoming of this dissolution, the negation of the negation, will allow human beings for the first time, will allow human history to begin and human beings to produce goodness, you know, truth and beauty in registers that were historically unimaginable before. So that the creation of values, you know, in the sense that, you know, Nietzsche is interested in, or Deleuze is interested in, you know, is precisely only becomes possible if one takes seriously capital's kind of dissolution and evaluation of every kind of, you know, regionally specific mode of value, and the historical transformation that would occur would then allow, you know, would open up this possibility of life producing life, of like this generic activity, which is not, in a way, which is not about fetishizing production. The point is that when life produces life, the category of production becomes obsolete, as does the category life. I think this is what Marx is saying. This is why he refuses to ontologize life and production, because these are, he's using kind of, you know, categorical resources that, you know, existing, you know, historically specific categorical resources to talk about what would happen if the horizon of social production, the existing horizon of social production was abolished and, you know, opened up so that human beings could produce, you know, without commodifying. And they could produce without commodifying and produce their own needs, produce their means and ends. And that's what freedom, that would be the realm of freedom. So I'm saying all this to point out that there is a kind of the radical emancipatory promise of Marx's account, which is truly kind of transfigurative in all the kind of the interesting senses that kind of Deleuze wants to kind of affirm or wants to kind of extract from Nietzsche. But I think that actually that the Marxian account, in a way, I think that kind of, in a way, I think that the mistake is to fetishize production and to fetishize creation and affirmation. Because if you do that, you end up kind of, you know, preemptively curtailing, you know, the possibility, the historical possibility of ushering in a mode of activity, let's say, which would be, you know, which would release human beings from the need to dominate. Okay? So that the whole kind of the economy of domination, okay, and of the will to power, which is fundamental for Nietzsche, would be rendered historically anachronistic by you know, the revolutionary transformation of production in Marx's sense. I think that's what, you know, Okay, I'm sorry for this kind of
No.
going off.
I think that was really helpful. I think I followed most of it. I think the only other interjection I wanted to make was to try to see if we could like talk about it in a concrete example, in case the abstraction of it was difficult to follow. But just to make sure I'm clear on it, it does seem to me like you're contrasting a sort of value as affirmation of a form of life versus value as meaning. On the other hand, is the other one on this distinction between is and ought for purposive activity to continue to shape things dialectically toward its own ends, right?
Yes, but the difference between is and ought, and this is another thing that I think is there is no such. Okay, and this is something that the difference between is and ought, is what is in a way kind of given. There is no is without an ought, and in a way, what's the point about the kind of as Nietzsche himself understands, the point about nihilism, active nihilism, is the overcoming of passive nihilism, which is the attempt to kind of to describe, to say that what is, to articulate the is and the oughts according to a moral evaluation of goodness or rightness, is that he supersedes this, but he replaces the moral is with an aesthetic, the moral ought with an aesthetic ought. Okay, so it's not that Nietzsche gets rid of like the ought altogether. On the contrary, he replaces it with the ought of creation, of affirming, creative destruction, etc., etc. Okay, so what he's doing is he's the transvaluation of values wants to in a way still operates in terms of the diremption of the is and the ought, but now it proposes to replace the reactive oughts of Judeo-Christianity, slave morality, whatever you want to call it, with this these active the values of self-creation, self-legislation, but also the pathos of distance, and the claim that suffering is no longer an objection to life. The affirmation of suffering, cruelty, and destruction, as not only ineliminable but necessary components of the value of existence. That's what Nietzsche's immoralism entails. Okay. Now, the point is that, so you see what's going on here is like you haven't immoralism is not the kind of the complete kind of dissolution of morality or of normativity. If by normativity you simply mean the difference between, you mean this kind of normative, what ought to be, what should be. So Nietzsche fully affirms the ought, the normative, but he's simply saying that this, we must affirm what was abominated, what was previously abominated, and the strength of will is shown by its capacity to affirm what's a decadent culture abominated. And in a way, it's that dichotomy that kind of I think that Marx entirely kind of circumvents by saying that in a way it's still a capitulation, this affirming, the affirming of this ought, of this normative ought, is still, it's the love of fate. It's the love, it's affirming what is as though it was fated to be this way. So in other words, it's an act of submission. Okay. Nietzsche is, it's a submission. It's a submission to for all of the talk about activity and overpowering. In fact, it's It's bowing down to the fatality of what is. And Marx is saying that it's precisely by, once we realize that what is what we have made, there's nothing, that there's a sense in which kind of, everything that we recognize as being is something that we have made either directly or indirectly. I mean, there's, that's what kind of, in a collective social sense, then we don't need to reevaluate what is, we can transform our way of making. And that's what kind of, free conscious activity or social production released from the constraints of, commodification in the class relation would bring about. And this doesn't entail, this in a way, this doesn't entail, instead of celebrating, hardness and cruelty as signs of kind of, virility or strength, you'd be able to kind of, the ability to assuage suffering, in fact, to eliminate unnecessary suffering, would be the kind of the greatest, manifestation of creativity and strength. So that's the sense in which, yes. So again, I've kind of gone off topic a bit, but that's the sense in which I'm trying to say that. So when, if I can, I only have a few kind of pages to go. When dialectics, according to Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, is all surreptitiously moralizing. Okay, it's all surreptitiously moralizing because it criticizes but never asks about the identity of the type of life or the type of subject who affirms these values and denounces these other ones. Okay. So what's required says true critique, or the kind of the transvaluation of critique according to Deleuze, would identify principles of internal genesis, not of external conditioning, but of internal genesis. And we need an account of the internal genesis of reason itself. Reason itself is a manifestation of a form of life or a way of being. What is the will which hides and expresses itself in reason, etc. I mean, this should all be familiar to you. Okay? I'm sure you all know this. And a new image of thought, so critique beyond truth would identify a new image of thought whose elements are sense and value. Okay, sense and value are the elements of thought. The categories of thought are not truth and falsity, but the noble and the base, the high and the low, depending on the nature of the forces that take hold of itself. Note the typology: noble, base, high, and low. Differentiation, distinction, the pathos of to evaluate is to differentiate in terms of types of force and types of will, active and reactive forces, affirmative and negative wills. Okay, so in a way, critique as evaluation is precisely is differentiation, is distinguishing or discrimination, and Nietzschean critique diagnoses the difference in types of will to power, affirmative or negative, underlying the difference in types of force, active or reactive. Whereas, so instead of this kind of this discrimination, this evaluation of discrimination, Marxian critique, by way of contrast, exposes the class relation, the capitalist class relation, which pits capitalists against proletariats, underlying society's self-knowledge. Every form of all self-understanding, and the self-understanding is always a kind of a mode of social self-understanding, is ultimately kind of conditioned, indirectly conditioned by the class relation, which is also what, in a way, philosophy or ideology tries to kind of occlude. Okay, it's the class relation that has to be kind of occluded by orthodox, science or ideology. For Nietzsche, or for Deleuze's Nietzsche, it's the economy of competing wills and forces that determines social relations, whereas for Marx, social relations give rise to forms, the commodity form, the value form, the state form, that determine the economy of forces. So this is why, so if we return to the opening question, in what sense is the critique of political economy redundant, or in what sense has it been superseded? Well, for Marx, political economy explains social relations in terms of competition and exchange, whereas the critique of political economy explains competition and exchange in terms of social relations. Competition and exchange are effects of a fundamental social antagonism, the class relation. And the class relation pits the capitalist who owns the means of production against the worker who owns only her labor power. The class relation separates the producer from her products as well as from the instruments of production. So now the question is, in what sense then, if this, in a way, if it's the critique, Marxian critique, in terms of it, to the extent to which it's always, drawing, leading investigation back to the class relation, the fundamental status, the uncircumventability of the class relation. The question is, and the class relation involves the separation of producers from the means of production, or of wage laborers from capitalists. Then the question is, has there really been, is real subsumption, the real subsumption, is it to be understood as domination, as a domination which can never be totalized, or as an enslavement, or as a mode of enslavement, which is totalizing? Okay, and here's a passage from A Thousand Plateaus, which I think is very, very interesting and relates in a way directly to the account that Reid was setting out in his introduction. So Deleuze and Guattari talk about this new regime of machinic enslavement, okay, by integrated global capital, what they call integrated global capital. So they write, it seems that in the capitalist regime, surplus labor becomes less and less distinguishable from labor, strictly speaking, and totally impregnates it. Modern public works have a different status from that of large-scale imperial works. How could one possibly distinguish between the time necessary for reproduction and extorted time, what Marx calls surplus labor, when they are no longer separated in time? Now, the ratio of surplus to necessary labor under real subsumption is an intensive quantity, which is to say that its magnitude is independent of the length of the working day. And Marx explicitly, in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx identifies the passage from the formal subsumption of labor to the real subsumption of labor in terms of the difference between what he calls absolute and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is created simply by lengthening the working day. Okay, so you kind of you extract more surplus value from wage labor. You make by making the worker work more, but you do this extensively by making them work longer. Okay. Relative surplus value is extracted through the intensification, not through the extension of the productivity of labor, but through the intensification of the productivity of labor. So you can do it by shortening the working day. You can increase the ratio of surplus to necessary labor, while reducing the working day. But labor can become more creative. It can create more value than it has itself, simply by through a process of intensification, of the intensification of productivity, which involves mechanization, technological innovation, and other kind of strategies. Okay, but the point is that this is the value ratio. The ratio of surplus to necessary labor is a value ratio of the commodity labor power to the value of the commodities produced through the consumption of labor power. And labor power is valued abstractly as abstract labor. The value of any commodity is measured abstractly by its exchangeability, its exchange value. But labor power, while being valued abstractly, is used concretely. Okay, so labor is exchanged abstractly, but used concretely in the labor process. The capitalist uses your concrete labor. Okay? And it's in a way, it's the difference between, it's the fact that labor is always simultaneously abstract and concrete that is the source of surplus value. That's where surplus value comes from. In a way, the kind of, the incommensurability, the structural incommensurability between the value of abstract commodified abstract labor power and the value created through the use of concrete labor, okay, which is the obverse of this abstract labor power. So the difference between abstract and concrete labor underlying Marx's theory of exploitation is a function of the class relation, which involves obviously the privatization of the means of production. And if this difference is obscured, if the difference between abstract and concrete labor is obscured, social abstraction is reified as a metaphysical power. You start talking about you start talking about kind of production in general, or abstract production or abstract productivity, as something that in a way can operate independently of labor, okay, and of the class relation, because the difference between abstract and concrete labor is a function of the class relation, the commodification of labor, and therefore of the privatization of the means of production, the separation of the producer from the means of production. Now, weirdly, Deleuze and Guattari immediately say this remark certainly does not contradict the Marxist theory of surplus value, for Marx shows precisely that surplus value ceases to be localizable in the capitalist regime. That is even his fundamental contribution. So they give there's no reference given for this claim. I mean, it's both, you could say that it's both, in one sense, you could say that, yes, surplus value, there's a sense in which it is and it's not localizable. I mean, the extraction of surplus value happens in the wage relation, in the consumption of labor power. But the question is whether this consumption takes place. The question is whether the site of the consumption of labor power can always be recognized. And I think that this is where Deleuze and Guattari, when Deleuze and Guattari claim that surplus value can be extracted independently of the wage relation, they are confusing in a way the fact that the invisibility or the unfamiliarity of the consumption of labor power for the suggestion that it's being the capitalist consumption of labor power has been kind of dissolved altogether. Okay, so for instance, they write, they're talking about, it gave him, i.e. Marx, a sense that machines would themselves become productive of surplus value, and that the circulation of capital would challenge the distinction between variable and constant capital. Okay, Marx does not think that machines themselves will become productive of surplus value. I mean, absolutely not. Okay. Nor that the distinction between variable and constant capital can be, superseded. Now, this is what they're saying. In these new conditions, it remains true that all labor involves surplus labor, but surplus labor no longer requires labor. Surplus labor, capitalist organization in its entirety, operates less and less by the striation of space-time corresponding to the physical social concept work. Once again, the claim that surplus labor no longer requires labor is simply based on, I think, on an obliteration of the difference between concrete and abstract labor, okay? And the fact that the wage laborer is compelled to sell her labor in order to reproduce herself, in order to, to exist. And surely they're not saying that people are no longer compelled to work to live. I mean, in fact, more and more human beings are being compelled into the wage relation than at any point in human history. So it seems absurd to suggest that surplus labor no longer requires necessary labor. The necessary labor has become, i.e., working in order to live has not been, more people have to work in order to live now, not less, okay? The social measure of labor is abstract labor time, which as social average is fixed independently of physical measure. But the non-physical character of abstract labor goes hand in hand with increasing spatiotemporal and psychic regimentation of concrete labor. Surplus value extraction is explained by the formal separability and real inseparability of abstract and concrete labor. Living labor is socially compelled to estrange, i.e., to sell itself as labor power, but this social compulsion follows from the class relation. Capital does not objectify living labor, it compels it to objectify itself. Labor is alienated, not because it is objectified, but because it is compelled to objectify itself. And this is why formal freedom is domination and not enslavement. Because capital dominates without enslaving, revolt is not sufficient to overcome it. Emancipation from the abstract domination concomitant with purely formal freedom, the formal freedom to, to sell your labor power to a capitalist, would entail a revolution in social production. Okay, so I think that this is, I think the very kind of suggestion that we've gone, that real subsumption ushers in this era of machinic enslavement, which renders the distinction between necessary and surplus labor redundant, and therefore the claim that it's the real subsumption occurs in the capitalist, the individual capitalist consumption of labor power. I think that this leads to retotalization. This leads to a kind of a metaphysical kind of reification or substantialization of capital as this kind of, this fluid kind of substance that permeates every aspect of psychic and social existence. And this is why, it is as though human alienation through surplus labor were replaced by generalized machinic enslavement, such that one may furnish surplus value without doing any work. Children, the retired, the unemployed, television viewers, etc. Not only does the user as such tend to become an employee, but capitalism operates less on a quantity of labor than by a complex qualitative process bringing into play modes of transportation, urban models, the media, the entertainment industries, ways of perceiving and feeling every semiotic system. But if it's true that consumption is exploitative and users have become employees, which I think it's true, this part of their analysis is correct. This is due to a mutation in the wage relation following from subsumptive exchange and not from the dissolution of the wage relation following from machinic enslavement. Capitalist production is value production, so that the complex qualitative process or semiosis, i.e. sense production, has an underlying homogeneity. Capital does not produce, which is to say, it doesn't commodify subjectivity. It creates conditions of reproduction that compel subjectivity or living labor to commodify itself in order to live, i.e. to sell itself to capital in order to live. And if the modes of perceiving and feeling entailed by self-commodification are socially mandated, they are modes of objectivation in Marx's sense and not subjectivation. Self-commodification is not subjective production. So when Jason Reed writes, labor has expanded to include the production of subjectivity, taste, desires, concepts, the production of subjectivity by subjectivity. Well, the point is that living labor's relation to self under capital is mediated by the objectivity of the commodity form and thereby the class relation. Okay, so what are the consequences? Real subsumption is only intelligible within the critique of political economy. It doesn't render it obsolete. And the mutation of critique thesis first ignores Marx's claim that the commodity is the cell form of capitalist production. This is inherited from Althusser, who insists on reading Marx by completely kind of, extracting, erasing the opening analysis of the commodity form. And it assumes that the base superstructure dyad is constitutive of the critique of political economy, which is the central. If you understand the claim that the commodity is the cell form of the capitalist social organism, the base superstructure dyad is immediately nullified. Okay, because if capitalist, if capitalist commodity production involves reproducing labor power as a commodity, then it stands to reason that all capitalist production involves commodification and the reproduction of the conditions of commodification. But this reproductive schema does not require the base superstructure. There are not two regimes of production, economic material production on the one hand, affects production on the other hand. And only on this basis can the account of real subsumption be replaced by the thesis of machinic enslavement, which reifies and separates social abstraction from the class relation. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, that's, I just wanted to get to the conclusion. Okay, I'm happy to, I realize, I've gone a bit over time, but I'm happy to, to discuss, to go through your questions. Matthias?
Yes. Yeah, so we're a bit over time, as you just said. Perhaps we can get, I don't know, 2 or 3 questions and then close it for today. And perhaps people can post also on the questions.
Sure, yes, of course, yeah.
The classroom page and so, or the Discord, I don't know which they prefer. So I don't know, so 2 or 3 questions, preferentially shorter ones. Who wants to go for it?
Okay, Maria, you've got, so Maria, Ivrim, and Matthew, I see, have their hands up. So Maria, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. We had a whole discussion about slave labor and why Marx distinguished between slave and voluntary labor, and what relation, the most acute question is what relation does it have with capital production? Since both of those are abstract labor, are there any different in how they produce capital? And will capital one day become human independent, just a robotic entity, and will become all slaves? Is it a possibility?
No, actually, I think the answer to that question is that, and this is why the difference between wage labor and slave labor is important. Now, people think that if you insist on this difference, you say that this is not to say that capitalism does not and has not used slave labor. Okay, and as we know, America was a capitalist economy which used slave labor. Slave labor can be a component of capitalist production. However, capitalism, I think, can never kind of enslave the labor force, because, and the reason it can't is that because it needs because it needs consumers. And it needs, and to have consumers, there must be a wage relation. In other words, there need to be consumers. There need to be people who have money to buy commodities, to purchase the commodities. You don't pay a slave, okay? And therefore you don't pay a slave, and therefore if you own, a slave is just a piece of property. A slave is just effectively, a speaking tool, as Aristotle puts it. So therefore, keeping the slave alive, keeping the slave in good working order is another expense for the capitalist. Okay, the slave labor is an instrument, in a way, is a part of the means of production, whereas wage labor is, in a way, is has to be consumed in the production process, but can't be, in a way, wholly integrated into the means of production. Okay, so the wage labor plays a role in the production process, and the role, in effect, is to convert fixed capital, okay, the fixed capital, the capital invested in machinery, in the means of production, into surplus value. And this process of converting, in a way, the whole process of creating surplus value requires wage labor. And I think that if you eliminate wage labor, well, or it seems to me that you eliminate, the essential resource for surplus value extraction. Now, of course, I think people think that the wage relation must, because Marx wrote so much about industrial capital and industrial production, people, in a way, it's the institution of the factory as the paradigm for the consumption of labor power and the extraction of surplus value, in a way that leads to these kind of, I think, confused debates about, since if with the sidelining of industrial production, at least in kind of Western Europe and North America, it seems that surplus value extraction is happening independently of the site of labor. Okay, but I think that what's happened, once you understand that all concrete labor is also abstract labor, and any kind of wage labor is abstract labor, then the consumption of labor power can happen, in an almost limitless variety of sites and locations, and it doesn't need to be. In other words, it doesn't need to look like a factory or kind of a traditional, manufacturing, a traditional place of manufacture or industrial production. And to answer Maria's question, I think that the spontaneity, the formal freedom of labor power is a condition of capitalist reproduction, which is why capitalism cannot enslave the workforce. And in fact, it's that would kind of completely destroy it. It would nullify. So in a way, that's why I think capitalism needs human beings, to need it to stay alive. But if it integrates them, if it does this without, compelling humans, it wants to compel human beings to kind of, to sell their labor power to it, but it doesn't simply want to kind of, to own humans, because that would completely kind of, short circuit the process of its kind of reproduction. So in a way, that's why I think, look at it this way: if capitalism is a parasite or a virus, a good virus wants to keep its host alive. It wants to keep its host alive because if it kind of completely kind of, if it kills its host, it will kind of, destroy itself. So I think that's why, you know, the capitalist virus is compelled to keep the kind of the human organism alive, albeit by compelling it into the wage relation. Okay, Ivrim.
Thanks. When you propose to replace Deleuze's transcendental account of Nietzsche's theory of forces with a Marxist notion of sociality and, of course, production, there I'm having difficulty in grasping how can an empirically and historically contingent phenomenon like sociality have a transcendental power. I mean, we have experiences that are not social, and also experience consists of objects that are not related to sociality, like the objects we observe and experience in scientific research, for example, or artistic experiences. So, I mean, my question is basically concerns Marx's relationship with Kant, and how can sociality have a transcendental power? How can it condition experience while it is itself an empirical occurrence?
Okay, that's a very good question, thanks. I think that Marx, what distinguishes Marx, the Marxian account of sociality and of, you know, what he calls social relations. What Marx does is that he says, where previous philosophers and metaphysicians had tried to give a positive account of the social relation, for instance, in terms of something like a social contract, Marx says that any such account is going to be, you know, a kind of an ad hoc rationalization, or kind of an ideological kind of, you know, an ideological fable of one kind or another. So what he wants to say is that what is the social relation? It's the fact that human beings, you know, depend on one another to stay alive, that they must collectively reproduce themselves. A human being, you know, to say that, you know, humans are social animals is to say that they can only, you know, they can only individually reproduce by collectively reproducing. Okay, and if you think about it, like even the kind of the sexual division, that's what Marx says, that the division of labor begins with the sexual division of labor. It means that you need at least two humans, you know, for biological reproduction. And of course, those two humans are always part of a kind of, you know, a larger group. So a human being, you know, a human individual, well, no, I won't use the category individual. I mean, that's a historical category, but it's simply to say, what Marx wants to say is that the ways in which humans have reproduced themselves are historically variable. But what he wants to say is that those ways develop independently of their consciousness. So it operates in a way, the mode of social reproduction operates behind the back of self-consciousness. So for instance, this is why I think Marx thinks that the social social relations as involving material reproduction is irreducible to any interpersonal or intersubjective relation. And for instance, Feuerbach wants to give a positive account of the social relation in terms of what he calls the, the I-thou relation, the relationship between two, self-consciousnesses, mutual recognition. For Marx, mutual recognition plays no role in sociality, it's simply kind of material interdependence that conditions a sociality, and this interdependence evolves, behind the back of self-consciousness. So this is why he thinks that, in a way, he only gives a kind of a negative account, apart from saying that human beings can only, reproduce themselves collectively. How they do this and with what success is historically variable, and open-ended. But what he then says is that, the forces of production and relations of production then, indirectly, mediate their relations to one another and their relations to nature. So in other words, how human beings relate to nature, okay, to non-social or to non-human nature, is always going to be, filtered through their, the means of production and the relations of production. And in that regard, what he's simply saying is that, how we understand nature, what aspects of nature we find useful or dangerous, etc., is always a function of this conjunction of productive forces and relations. This does not involve, it's not, so now you use the word transcendental. Transcendental, I think here is, if by transcendental you mean necessary, okay, you mean like a necessary condition, then okay, it's transcendental in the sense of being, kind of an indispensable structural condition for our relationships to one another or to non-human nature. But it's not transcendental in any kind of constitutive or genetic sense. And also it's not transcendental because for Marx, you can't, it's not transcendental because there is no production in general, okay, whose positive modes could be specified a priori. If it was transcendental, reflection alone, transcendental reflection would allow you to distinguish between, universally necessary and, historically contingent features of production. But Marx says that it's not, transcendental reflection won't allow you to kind of, to distinguish the necessary from the contingent features of social production. Only history, only contingent history gives you the resources to do so. So that's why I think the term transcendental is of limited utility in this context. Okay, Matthew.
Hey there, thanks. So I think my question, we've been talking a lot about this kind of distinction between like macro and micro politics. And, one of the other threads that's moving through Anti-Oedipus, other than Marx, is obviously the question of like psychoanalysis and French psychoanalysis with Lacan in particular. And I guess when we're talking about Marx and we have this idea of then a kind of objectification that would be unalienated as the kind of horizon or the eschatological horizon for communism, is not Deleuze and Guattari, they're not trying to track the ways in which there are other forms of compulsion that are built into systems of determination, like Lacan is doing with language, right? And for Lacan, the unconscious and the relationship to language there, it means that there's a kind of a fundamental diremption between particularity and universality. And so in a sense, all linguistic universality is a kind of spurious universality. And so this kind of horizon of non-spurious universality becomes problematic in a sense. So I was just wondering how you think about that kind of problem.
there's a lot in your, there's a lot in your question. I mean, do you mind rephrasing the kind of what you think are the, it's my fault. It's not your fault. It's not you. It's just because I'm slow, and it's I didn't get everything in the question. Yeah. So, but I got the contrast you were saying between. I mean, can you rerun your initial point about Deleuze and Guattari?
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is that if free conscious activity is the kind of horizon that communism is after, so a kind of objectification that wouldn't result in estrangement, like a self-objectification that wouldn't result in estrangement, because they're coming from the Lacanian kind of like in that milieu, that idea of an objectification where particularity and universality would be linked to each other, it creates like there's this kind of sense of a necessary insufficiency that I think they're trying to overcome by rethinking the relationships between these kind of more granular compulsions about language and all of this kind of stuff. And you see what I'm saying? Like, because the question is, if language is a condition that like if it's unconscious in Lacanian sense, and it creates that gap between particularity and universality, then how could free conscious activity as unalienated objectivity occur without even the abandonment of language in a way?
Okay, I see. No. Okay, that's a very, very interesting question. Okay, yes. So the Lacanian point would be that kind of alienation. There's a constituent. Actually, Samuel Tomczyk's book on Marx and Lacan makes this point, I think, extremely clearly, that there's a kind of a constituting alienation, that to be human is to be alienated in in the symbolic order in language. The question is, remember, like in Marx, following Hegel, there's externalization and estrangement. Alienation covers as a kind of a positive and a negative sense, and it's not clear the sense in which from a Lacanian viewpoint, this constitutive alienation is a positive enabling feature of human subjectivation, and so it couldn't be overcome. So in a sense,
it means that the dialectic can't close itself, basically.
Yes.
It means there's a kind of a fundamental negativity in which so it's a different way of having to lead to an affirmation of a kind of constitutive suffering or alienation, but it doesn't have the same flavor as the transvaluation one.
Yes, and I actually think that in a way, what is misleading, or what is kind of perhaps what's problematic about the kind of the life producing life, is that it's an entirely kind of positive kind of formulation. In a way, I think that Marx would, happily concede, and the ineliminability of constitutive alienation, which is to say of a kind of of a negativity, as constitutive of human being, and in a way of human social production. But then I think that it's almost as if there's when we produce, on his account, okay, so we generate, human productive activity generates these social forms, which actually, starts, commandeering it, to their own end. That's what capital is. It's the, as he puts it, it's the alien social form that commandeers and co-opts human activity, to serve itself. And so then the question is, well, is it possible to kind of, if that's, alienation could be overcome? The question is that is that also to say that this kind of, you know, the alienation in the symbolic order, the alienation that is indispensable for linguistic activity could also be eliminated? And then, but yeah, and
because I think that's where Deleuze and Guattari are going. I think they're trying to not only think the resistance to the alienation of capital, but also to that symbolic level. And that's why the micropolitics question, I think, comes back again, is because they're trying to work through that as an issue as well.
Okay. So because I wasn't sure whether you were saying that they were endorsing part of the Lacanian account or rejecting it, or
I think they're endorsing the role that the subjective, the symbolic plays in alienation via identification, and then trying to find a mode of collectivity that doesn't operate via identification as its primary, the kind of synthesis.
Yes. Okay.
But anyway, that's you know, far down the line, but yeah.
Yes. No. I see. I see. I think that's you know, that's right. But then what complicates it is that it ends up being yes, what they call they're looking for more, you know, kind of modes of collective, you know, what they call, you know, collective assemblages of enunciation, etc. Collective subjectivation that doesn't involve this these symbolic identifications. And I mean, that's one of the most interesting aspects of their account, but then the problem is that, I mean, because of the whole rejection of negativity, of like all these, they're kind of rhetorical attacks on, you know, on lack, on negativity, on castration, and you know, the valorization of, you know, affirmation. That's, you know, it's not clear that they you know, I think perhaps initially they kind of, you know, well, Guattari was, you know, a Lacanian. It's not clear at what points you can, you know, convert a structure into a machine, you know, as, you know, the title of Guattari's, you know, paper, where he's drawing the contrast between kind of structures and machines. It seems that machines function entirely, well, there's this moment of anti-production, which has already been mentioned, and of disjunctive, but the point is that it's only, it's not negativity. Anti-production or disjunction is a condition of conjunction, I think, in Deleuze and Guattari, and they are adamant, they refuse to kind of, you know, they reject the separation, you know, of negation or of negativity. And actually, this is something, you know, we'll kind of look at more closely. I can't, yeah, this is, I mean, your question is very good. It's a very, it's a difficult question to answer, actually. So I can't really answer it properly, but it's a very good question.
May I contribute?
Sure, yes.
On page 52, I have the Bloomsbury edition, but it's the same translation as the one that you gave us. On page 52, it says about Jacques Lacan and his signifying chains, les chaînes signifiantes, and then they try to explain how the machine code operates through Lacan's signifying chains. And then it says that the support of these chains is the body without organs. In my opinion, this is problematic because it goes to this idea of a ground where everything is placed, even though they are dispersed and they create nomadic distributions instead of vertical hierarchies, again, we have this idea of the ground. And the ground creates exteriorities and interiorities. So needless to say that Lacan and this reflective relationship between language and reality is also problematic. So in my opinion, this is very problematic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. I mean, actually the notion of code and actually the contrast between code and signification is, I think, crucial. And I think that because codes for Deleuze and Guattari are asignifying, they're not part of, they're a condition. Every kind of signifying order presupposes a kind of a certain codification, regimes of codification, etc., but which are themselves asocial, which are kind of ubiquitous material phenomena, because so the kind of and in a way the coding of flows, there are no kind of, all flows are always already coded, which is why the kind of the decoding of flows is only kind of only happens on the basis of a kind of a prior coding or a codification. Means that there's also kind of in a way it's the closest they get to a kind of a dialectical articulation of immediacy and mediation. The point is that everything has a kind of structure. Everything has a kind of
yeah, but structure doesn't mean representation. A code doesn't have to be an illustration of something, a representation of something. A code can be a signal, can be a pulse.
Sure, but the problem then is the code is a category. The distinction between coding and decoding, the distinction between flows and codes, these are concepts, okay? When you say that the kind of the real itself, nature itself, involves this kind of this articulation of coded flows, the coding and the decoding of flows, it's all very well to say that this occurs, independently of representation, but so does biological reproduction, so does kind of, geological accretion. These all operate independently of representation, but you need the resources of representation to know about them. The claim of representation is not that to be is to be representable. That's not what Kant says at all. He's saying that to know something, you need to represent it. To know about the accretion of the earth, you need to be able to kind of, conjoin concepts, in propositional form, to be able to kind of, to say something about, to say something about something's being thus and so, okay? To say that, in other words, there's a confusion between the claim that knowledge has propositional form and the claim that reality has propositional form. And it seems that I don't think that there's, well, I mean, a good materialist can insist that reality does not have propositional form, but still, insist that knowledge of reality must have propositional form. And the claim is that when you say that your own account of reality is non-propositional, that's when the difficulties begin. In other words, how can you know about reality without representing it? That's it. And if you claim that you're in, because if you claim that you know about reality without representing it, well, what kind of knowledge is this? Is it intuition? You just intuit that this is the way the world is, this is how things work. But if you're intuiting it, it can't have conceptual form. But code is nothing if not a conceptual category. it's actually very difficult to understand what a code. You don't just intuit the coded structure of flows. You see what the problems are. I think the problems are that people think that people confuse the claim that you can't know what is, without judgment, that knowledge is a condition of saying anything intelligible about being, with the claim that knowledge constitutes being. Berkeley, is a philosopher who says that to be is to be perceived, to be is to be experienced. But Kant doesn't say that to be is to be represented. He simply says that to know that anything is thus and so involves representing it. So there's a this is I just want to
just on I mean I just want to to set our time, because I think we are getting like too late now, and I think we should probably keep the discussions going. I don't know, in the classroom or something, or save the questions for next time.
Sure. So I'm sorry, this Mstislav had his hand raised, and I didn't answer his question. But if you, I'm willing to answer your question, now quickly, if it's not too complicated, because you've been waiting for a long time.
Yes, my question is not so huge. I think it would be easy to answer it. So I want to come back to the concept of generic production, and just wanted to ask what is the relation between the notion of generic production of value and generic production of free conscious activity in Marx works, since as far as you have mentioned, his notion of generic production of free conscious activity is related, can be attributed to his early works, then I have deduced, as far as I can presume, that the production of value can be attributed to capital or some works of this period. So what is the relation between these two notions? Are they completely distinct? Should they be regarded in this way? Or one can be viewed as augmentation or addition to another one, something like this?
Okay. Yes, so the question is that obviously in capital, so generic production is generic value production. The question is whether they stand to one another as negative and positive. Okay, the question is whether, in order to be able to characterize kind of what's wrong with capitalist value production, or the way in which capitalist value production is a form of abstract domination by value, the subordination of all human activity, cognitive and practical, to the imperative of value creation. Whether the claim that that's an illegitimate form of domination, of social domination, requires the countervailing positive claim that there's a form of production without domination. There's a form of coordinated social activity that doesn't entail domination, either concrete domination, concrete dominations which you have in kind of your ancient and feudal societies, or abstract domination which you have in capital. So although Marx doesn't say anything about kind of the generic productivity of free conscious activity in his later work, at least to the best of my knowledge, it does seem to be, I think, communism, which is production freed from the imperatives to kind of to reproduce value and to amplify and feed abstract value, whether that doesn't require the concept of of generic production as free conscious activities. The difficulties are, okay, the biggest objection to saying this is that, well, it seems to imply the overcoming of alienation. You know, this complete kind of overcoming of you know, social alienation. Though Marx says that it involves it involves objectification, involves kind of, you know, objectification, but an objectification that wouldn't kind of be co-opted by this, you know, these alien social forms. In other words, the claim is that can human beings reproduce themselves without generating alien social forms? Because that's what unalienated production would be. And I think that's a difficult question. Maybe there would be new types of alienation. Maybe Marx, all that Marx is saying is that this is a particularly punitive and destructive form of alienation, subordination to an alien social power, and there would be other kind of less punitive forms. But that's. But I think, in a way, I don't think. I think people are too kind of. There's been, you know, in the wake of, there's this kind of paranoia about, you know, there's this paranoia about, you know, the claim about the overcoming of alienation as involving a kind of some kind of metaphysical essentialism, and I think that you know, in a way, I think it becomes unnecessarily kind of prohibitive, and I think that there's a positive sense. I think that Marx needs to have a positive sense of, you know, generic. You know, generic human activity, free conscious activity, that doesn't involve, you know, that at least that doesn't involve the forms of alienation that we have recognized so far. And anyway, so the risk would be, can we know that this won't involve another kind of, you know, more, you know, an unforeseeable or not currently unimaginable form of alienation? Perhaps it will, but the claim would be that surely that can't be used as a reason to disqualify it, because that would simply perpetuate what is. And the claim it was Marx is always like, well, because he hasn't told us enough about what communism would be, it's not worth. It becomes easy to kind of say, well, it's not worth the risk. Better the devil you know. But I think that Marx's whole point is that, you know, in a way, part of what is most objectionable about, you know, capital is that we know it so, you know, that we do, it is, you know, hideously familiar. So that the kind of the risk of, you know, an unfamiliar estrangement or an unpredictable estrangement is worth taking.
Thank you.
Okay, I realize we've gone over, so I'm sorry. Yes, but if people have more questions about this session, if you could write them. And next week we'll start with chapter 1 of Anti-Oedipus, but also if you could please read Dan Smith's essay, which is Flow, Code and Stock, a note on Deleuze's political philosophy, because I think it's very, very helpful for you know, understanding what's going on in at the opening of Anti-Oedipus. Okay.
May I ask about the presentations?
Yes.
How long should they be, and is there a specific format that you would like them to have?
Matthias, would you?
Yeah. So usually we have 15 to 20 minutes presentations, and the format is pretty free. So whatever that you and your group agree upon, it's usually good enough. So you should just, I'll send an email with some of the details. But in general, yeah, you record a presentation about one of the topics that you choose, and and then you upload it to the drive, and we can all watch and comment on a further moment. So that's it.
Thank you.
So I think on this note, we should probably just finish. Is it okay, Ray?
Yes, sure, yeah, yes. Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. When's the due date for the assignments and the presentations? Is there a due date?
I need to, I guess, I need to figure out what perhaps, I guess, Matthias, is the order, do people volunteer? The order of so people volunteer. So I guess whoever already has a sense of what they would like to present, if they can kind of say they'd like to go first, so then, you know, we can, you know, the order in which people do it will be kind of determined by, you know, their eagerness or their preparedness to do it. And if people want more time or would prefer to kind of, you know, save it till later, that's okay too. If they're going, given that they're going to be uploaded, you know, in a way they don't have to be, I guess, you know, we should have a few of them done by, I don't know, session 4, so that, you know, they're not all left till the very end. But
okay, what about the essay then?
And the essay, the essay will be on a topic of your choice.
And that's
or I can give you, I mean, I can also give you cues, or I can suggest questions if that's helpful. But it was suggested to me that I just leave it up to, you know, to students to decide for themselves.
No, but the due date for that, sorry, is what I'm asking. End of the semester. End of the
series. It's usually 2 weeks after the last class. So
okay.
Keep that.
And how many words?
I'd say around 5,000 words.
All right. All right. If we have not any more practical questions, I think I'll just end the session and we see meet y'all next week. So thanks everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.